When Emily Carter first met Daniel Brooks, she never thought he would become the kind of person she couldn't stop thinking about. It wasn't as though she had been searching for someone to occupy her mind, nor was she actively looking for romance at the time. She had just moved to Boston to start a new position as a project coordinator for a marketing firm, and her life was consumed by unpacking boxes, navigating the subway system, and learning the ropes at her demanding new job. Daniel came into the picture unexpectedly, the way the most persistent thoughts often do, quietly at first, and then all at once. They met at a coffee shop near Emily's office on a rainy Tuesday morning. She was fumbling for change in her bag, frustrated because she was running late for a meeting, when he stepped forward and covered the rest of her bill without hesitation. "You looked like you needed a rescue," he said with a small smile. Emily laughed, grateful but slightly embarrassed, and insisted she could pay him back. He waved it off, told her it wasn't necessary, and disappeared into the crowd of people outside. She didn't even know his name then, but something about his calm presence stayed with her through the day. Over the next few weeks, she started seeing him around more often. Sometimes in that same coffee shop, other times walking down the street near her office building. They would exchange polite smiles or a few words, but nothing more. Yet, despite the briefness of their encounters, Emily found herself wondering about him far more than she expected. It started innocently, just a flicker of curiosity about who he was, what he did for a living, and why he always seemed so composed. But that flicker grew into a constant hum in the back of her mind. Even on days when she didn't see him, she caught herself scanning crowds, hoping for a glimpse. One evening, as she was walking home from work, she spotted him again, this time standing outside a small bookstore. He was holding a copy of a novel she loved, and something in her felt like it clicked. Without overthinking, she walked up to him. "Good choice," she said, nodding toward the book. Daniel looked up, surprised but smiling. "You've read it." They stood there for 10 minutes discussing the author, the plot, and the parts of the story that had stuck with them. It was the most they had ever spoken, and when they parted ways, Emily realized she was smiling the whole walk home. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations began happening more frequently. They discovered they both loved quiet mornings, old jazz records, and late-night walks by the waterfront. Emily learned he was a photographer who traveled often for work, capturing cityscapes and human moments in places she had only read about. Still, she didn't fully understand why she couldn't stop thinking about him. Was it simply attraction? Or was it something deeper, a connection that went beyond the surface? She started researching articles late at night about why people can't get certain individuals out of their minds. She read about psychology, about how the brain forms associations, and how certain interactions trigger dopamine release. She learned about the way small moments, especially those tied to emotion, can become etched into our memory and loop in our thoughts. But with Daniel, it wasn't just chemistry, it was the way he made her feel understood in such a short span of knowing each other. He had a way of listening without interrupting, of remembering the little details she'd mentioned weeks ago. It wasn't grand gestures that made him unforgettable, it was the subtle, consistent ways he showed he cared. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the human mind often latches onto people who awaken a part of us we didn't know was dormant. Maybe Daniel reminded her of the kind of life she wanted to live, calm, present, and connected to the world in a meaningful way. Or maybe he represented possibility, the kind that made everyday routines feel less predictable. One Friday night, Emily received a text from him out of the blue. "I'm at the waterfront. Thought you might like to join." She didn't even hesitate. She grabbed her jacket and headed out. When she arrived, he was leaning against the railing, looking out over the city lights reflecting on the water. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. They shared stories about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams. Emily told him about her move to Boston and how overwhelming it had been. Daniel admitted that he often traveled to avoid feeling stuck in one place for too long. At some point, Emily asked him directly, "Do you ever think about how certain people just stay in your head, even when you don't want them to?" Daniel looked at her for a moment, then said softly, "All the time. And I think sometimes it's because they're supposed to be there. Like they're meant to teach you something, or remind you of something you've forgotten about yourself. That night, walking home, Emily realized she no longer needed to question why she thought about him so much. The reason didn't have to be scientific or logical. Sometimes, people just fit into the spaces you didn't realize were empty. Over the next several months, Daniel became an even bigger part of her life. They continued their long walks, their coffee shop conversations, and their late-night texts about everything from travel to philosophy. She still thought about him constantly, but now, it didn't feel like an unshakable mystery. It felt like a choice. Emily learned that the mind often lingers on people who leave an emotional imprint, whether through kindness, shared experiences, or a unique perspective on life. And sometimes, the reason you can't stop thinking about someone is simply because they've become part of the story you're still writing. By the end of that year, Emily wasn't just thinking about Daniel, she was living a chapter with him. And though the future was uncertain, she no longer feared the thoughts that followed her. She welcomed them, because they reminded her that some connections are worth holding on to, no matter how they begin.